Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. Our reading this morning is from Karen Armstrong, Fields of Blood, the introduction. Each of us has not one, but three brains that coexist uneasily. In the deepest recesses of our gray matter, we have an old brain that we inherited from the reptiles that struggled out of the primal slime 500 million years ago. Intent on their own survival, with absolutely no altruistic impulses, these creatures were solely motivated by mechanisms urging them to feed, fight, flee when necessary, and reproduce. Those best equipped to compete mercilessly for food, ward off any threat, dominate territory, and seek safety naturally passed along the genes. So these self-centered impulses could only intensify. But sometime after mammals appeared, they evolved what neuroscientists call the limbic system, perhaps about 120 million years ago. Formed over the core brain derived from the reptiles, the limbic system motivated all sorts of new behaviors, including the protection and nurture of the young, as well as the formation of alliances with other individuals that were invaluable in the struggle to survive. And so, for the first time, sentient beings possess the capacity to cherish and care for creatures other than themselves. Although these limbic emotions would never be as strong as the me-first drives still issuing from our reptilian core, we humans have evolved a substantial hardwiring for empathy with other creatures, and especially for our fellow humans. Eventually, the Chinese philosopher Mencius, 371 to 288 BCE, would insist that nobody was wholly without such sympathy. If a man sees a child teetering on the brink of a well about to fall in, he would feel her predicament in his own body and would reflexively, without thought for himself, lunge forward to save her. There would be something radically wrong with anyone who could walk past such a scene without a flicker of disquiet. For most, these sentiments were essential, though Mencius thought somewhat subject to individual will. You can stamp on these shoots of benevolence just as you can cripple or deform yourself physically. On the other hand, if you cultivated them, they would acquire strength and dynamism of their own. We cannot entirely understand Mencius's argument without considering the third part of our brain. About 20,000 years ago, during the Paleolithic age, human beings evolved a new brain, the neocortex, home of the reasoning powers and self-awareness that enable us to stand back from the instinctive, primitive passions. Humans thus became roughly as they are today, subject to the conflicting impulses of their three distinct brains. The Unholy Trinity. It used to be said that a Unitarian was merely a Christian who couldn't count to three. That joke is, of course, based on the doctrine of the Trinity, which holds sway in most Orthodox Christian faiths, whether Protestant, Catholic, Evangelical, or Eastern, a doctrine from which our Unitarian and most of our Universalist forebears dissented. We will not undermine that dissent, but today I want to contrast the doctrine of the Holy Trinity with a sort of unholy Trinity in evolutionary psychology, which holds that there are three functional components of the human brain as set out in the reading I just did. What does a triune brain, a brain in three parts, do to our notions of responsibility for the consequences of our actions? These days, many UUs will bristle at the suggestion that there's anything Christian about our faith at all. All have to acknowledge that both branches, the Unitarian and the he knew that they now knew they were naked and thus must have eaten the forbidden fruit. So St. Paul says that without the original prohibition of the law, sin would not arise. And yet he argues that the followers of Jesus are discharged from the law. How then can sin still affect them? Because of another distinction which Paul makes between the spirit and the flesh. He says, quote, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me." Unquote. Here's an ingenious answer to the question of responsibility for doing what we ought not to do. We're not free actors, for we've been sold into slavery under sin. Sin, in St. Paul's view, is an agent. Sin can be a source of willpower, or as we would put it in modern language, sin has legs. The law is spiritual, but the spirit and the flesh are two different substances, and sin is master of the flesh. When I do a sinful action, it is not I that does it in Paul's view, it is sin. In other words, we're not one actor, we're not one agent, we're at least two. When we're acting well, we're under the law, and we can claim the good actions as our own. When we're acting badly, it is not us doing the acting, but sin. So that is a conventional Christian view of doing what we ought not to do, and leaving undone what we ought to have done. What would a religious naturalist view look like? It would look for the sources of human behavior in human nature, and most particularly in the neuroanatomy of the human brain and the hormones that govern behavior. Karen Armstrong's book, Fields of Blood, attempts to investigate the relationship between religion and violence. And in the introduction, which I read a moment ago, she starts her analysis of the roots of violence and warfare with human nature, specifically with three different brains, or more accurately, three different systems in the human brain, each with a different evolutionary past. There's a system of structures called the reptilian brain, because it is so anciently shared with reptiles, from whose branch of the tree of evolution our branch diverged 500 million years ago. It consists of mechanisms to help the organism flee, fight, feed, and reproduce. who's been married to the same woman for 53 years. Reuben has an active professional life and attends conferences and meetings all over the world. He was describing the strains which threatened his marriage, and he expressed it this way. When the Enlightenment came along, it dealt only with the cortex. It did not touch the limbic system. Now, what did Reuben mean by that? The so-called Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century Europe and America is a source of our modern scientific worldview, and among other things, sought to enthrone reason as the supreme human value. So Reuben was saying that all the rational considerations, which would counsel us to stay faithful to our absent spouses, have to contend with other drives, which have conditioned us to learn to relate, to mate, to fall in love with people who attend conferences with us. Reuben was not confessing to having given in to these limbic impulses, only to recognizing their pull. And in that recognition, it seems to me, is liberation. Put yourself in his shoes. I'm having these feelings for a woman other than my spouse back home. If I follow St. Paul, these feelings are part of my flesh, and I can hate myself for having them. But if I can say, oh, it's only my limbic system talking, I can understand it in a way that removes the shame. I'm still responsible for holding these impulses in check. If I fall into the spell of another woman at a conference, I will not be able to tell my wife. It was my limbic system, not me. In a way, this three-part view of human nature is akin to the three parts of the personality in Freud's thought: the id, the ego, and the superego. The analogy is not exact, but here's the point of likeness. In Freud's scheme, it is the job of the superego to hold in check the instinctive impulses arising from the id, and the ego mediates this tension between the other two. The great insight of Freud is the idea of the unconscious, that so much of what happens in our personalities happens off stage. We have drives that motivate us without us being